In late 1969, the receiver was called to Stanmore, Middlesex. The gates of the J&A Margolin factory were locked. The assembly lines stopped moving. A brand that supplied millions of sets was insolvent. The workforce was dispersed. The Dansette name was sold to the Rank organization. It was quietly slapped onto cheap imported goods. The original engineers would never have recognized them. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. It was the absolute center of British teenage life. It was the name on the portable radio in the park and the record player in the bedroom. But the real story of Dansette in Britain is not merely the closure of a factory in Middlesex. It is the story of how the British teenager first acquired a private voice, entirely separate from the family sitting room. It is the story of portable audio, changing broadcasting standards, and a high street market that praised heritage, but ultimately rewarded cheapness and convenience. Somewhere in a kitchen, sitting room, shed, loft, workshop, or old radio cabinet, there is a tuning dial that once meant something. We tell those stories. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In a cabinet-making workshop in East London in the early 1930s. Before the teenager existed as a recognized commercial demographic, listening to the broadcast signal in Britain was a stationary, communal, and strictly hierarchical affair. The object that brought voices into the home was a valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era. These sets were magnificent, heavy, mains-powered pieces of furniture. They were housed in dark, polished wooden cabinets made of walnut or mahogany veneer. They sat squarely in the sitting room or the front room, occupying a place of profound domestic importance. They required a permanent connection to the household mains electricity, a careful warm-up period for the glass valves to glow, and often a long external wire draped across the garden fence to act as a reliable aerial. In a 1950s British household, the parents dictated the tuning dial. The BBC Home Service provided the evening news, the solemn announcements, and the trusted national narrative. The light program provided the permitted light entertainment and the weekend comedies. The wireless set, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source, belonged entirely to the adults. The cabinet was treated with the same respect as a dining table. The volume was kept at a respectable level. If a young person wished to listen to popular music, they listened on adult terms, on adult furniture, at times strictly permitted by the head of the household. What the emerging British youth market lacked was autonomy. They lacked an object they could carry to a friend's house, take to a local park, or hide in a suburban bedroom. They lacked a private frequency. The solution to this British absence did not begin with electronics, but with woodwork. In the early 20th century, Maurice Margolin, a Russian immigrant, established a modest cabinet-making business in East London. Alongside his brothers, the Margolins built a formidable reputation for constructing solid, reliable wooden casings for other manufacturers. By the 1930s, operating under the name J&A Margolin, they had expanded their ambitions and moved into musical instruments, eventually setting up a bustling facility on Broadwick Street in Soho, London. Their first major breakthrough in the domestic audio market was a device called the Plus-A-Gram. This was a turntable unit designed to plug directly into the amplification circuit of a standard domestic radio. It essentially turned the family wireless into a radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, or in this instance, two linked components. The Margolins understood a fundamental truth early on. The cabinet was just as important as the circuit. The physical presentation of the object dictated how the British public felt about it. As the 1950s progressed, J&A Margolin launched the Dansette brand, initially dominating the teenage bedroom with their brightly colored, highly portable record players. They captured the physical space of British youth. But the Margolin family realized that a record player only solved half the teenage listening equation. The teenager also needed a voice from the outside world. They needed a radio that matched the aesthetic of their Dansette Major or Dansette Bermuda record player. In 1959, to meet exploding national demand for their products, J&A Margolin moved operations from their older premises to a massive, modern, purpose-built factory facility. This operation eventually expanded into a vast, sprawling industrial complex in Stanmore, Middlesex. This Stanmore factory became the undisputed engine room of British teenage audio. Here, Dansette made the critical strategic leap from merely spinning vinyl records to capturing the airwaves. They decided to enter the portable radio market. They applied their absolute mastery of wooden framing, Rexine fabric coverings, two-tone color schemes, and brass effect fittings to portable radio receivers. They understood that the youth market did not want a radio that looked like a piece of Victorian furniture. They wanted an accessory. They wanted an ecosystem. When the early Dansette portable radios hit the British high street, they bypassed the traditional serious radio hobbyist entirely. They were placed prominently in the front windows of local independent radio dealers, department store radio counters, and co-op electrical departments across the country. A young listener could walk into a high street shop and hand over roughly 13 to 15 guineas, equivalent to several weeks of a junior clerk's wages at the time, and walk out with absolute listening freedom. For those who could not afford the outright cash price, these radios were secured on hire purchase agreements, paid off in weekly shillings, or ordered through the thick pages of traditional mail-order catalogs. Available reports indicate that the Stanmore factory was soon pumping out hundreds of thousands of units across their entire audio range, employing hundreds of local workers to staple the Rexine and solder the chassis. Dansette was no longer just a record player company. They were a youth lifestyle brand. They had successfully built a radio that did not belong to the sitting room. It belonged to the teenager. The breakthrough for Dansette as a radio brand was not purely technological. It was entirely cultural. The Dansette RT222, introduced in the early 1960s, is a masterclass in reading a specific British market moment. To understand the breakthrough, one must look at the object exactly as a teenager encountered it in a high street shop window in 1962. It sat proudly behind the glass of independent radio dealers, flanked by heavy washing machines and somber television sets, demanding attention. The RT222 was a transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly. It was rectangular, roughly the size of a thick hardback book. It was wrapped tightly in brightly colored Rexine or vinyl leatherette, often in striking, optimistic combinations of bright red and cream, or powder blue and white. It had a sturdy, brass effect carrying handle that felt cold and substantial in the hand. On the front face, it featured a clear, circular tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to. Inside the wooden and board cabinet, it contained a printed circuit board, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them. It relied on a ferrite rod aerial, a small internal aerial often used in portable radios for medium-wave reception. This single internal component was the absolute key to its magic. It meant the radio required no external wires. It required no mains plug. It was completely self-contained. The listener only needed to unclip the back panel, Insert a heavy, ever-ready battery into the casing. Turn the volume control, the knob or slider that changes the loudness of the sound, and the set came alive instantly. There was no agonizing warm-up time. There was no waiting for glass valves to glow. It was instant, private audio. The British price context was crucial to its ubiquity. At around 14 guineas, roughly equivalent to a fortnight's wages for a young factory apprentice at the time, a Dansette radio was a significant investment, but it was an achievable one. It was bought on hire purchase agreements at local radio dealers, paid off in weekly shillings by teenagers who had just entered the workforce. It was ordered from the thick, glossy pages of mail-order catalogs. It was carried proudly out of co-op electrical departments in provincial towns. The British radio moat that Dansette built was its undeniable, unbreakable aesthetic link to youth. Other established British manufacturers like Murphy Radio in Welwyn Garden City or Pye in Cambridge were building excellent, perhaps even superior, transistor radios. But a Pye Cambridge still looked like something an uncle would own. A Roberts portable, wrapped in dark leather, looked like it belonged in a Surrey drawing room. A Dansette looked like a party. It was specifically designed to match the Dansette Bermuda record player sitting in the corner of the bedroom. It was part of an audio ecosystem. It was an accessory as much as an instrument. Early British reception was driven entirely by the demographic it served, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers. Serious radio hobbyists, reading magazines like Practical Wireless, sometimes scoffed at their simplistic circuitry. They noted that the Stanmore engineers prioritized visual appeal and volume over cutting-edge electronic selectivity. How well a radio separates one station from nearby stations. But the serious hobbyist was never the target. The target was the 16-year-old girl in a suburban bedroom in Manchester, or the young clerk in Bradford, who wanted a device that their parents did not control. Early British market metrics showed an explosion in youth ownership. Industry estimates suggest that within a few years, Dansette was shifting tens of thousands of these portable radio units. The massive Stanmore facility was transformed into a powerhouse of teenage consumption, soldering boards, wiring speakers, and stapling vinyl at an unprecedented rate. And what that ecosystem received was just as important as how it looked. The Dansette portables were designed primarily for medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, and long wave, a lower-frequency broadcast band used for long-distance national radio reception. When the sun went down over Britain, a curious atmospheric phenomenon occurs on the medium-wave band, allowing signals to travel much further across the continent. It was in the dark, under the bed covers, that the Dansette transistor radio fulfilled its true purpose. Teenagers slowly rotated the dial, searching past the BBC Light program for the fading, crackling, thrilling signal of Radio Luxembourg. By 1964, they were tuning those same dials toward the North Sea, trying to pick up the illicit pirate broadcasts of Radio Caroline. The Dansette was the physical bridge between those offshore broadcasts and the British bedroom. Every dial, every room, every voice. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. The years between 1960 and 1966 represent the absolute peak of the Dansette empire. The Margolin family had not simply built a successful electronics company. They had constructed a sprawling industrial behemoth that was perfectly tuned to the frequency and the financial realities of British youth. The British listening ecosystem during this era was entirely dependent on a network of distinct geographic, commercial, and broadcast pillars. The physical components, the wooden and board cabinets, the Rexine fabric, the The brass handles and the printed circuit boards were manufactured, sourced, and assembled at the massive Dansette works in Stanmore, Middlesex. The broadcast signal that gave these objects purpose was pumped out across the country by the towering aerials of the BBC's Droitwich transmitting station, or beamed through the night sky from the commercial transmitters of Radio Luxembourg. The finished portable radios did not sell themselves. They were distributed through a vast, highly efficient network of high-street electrical shops and retail channels. They were placed proudly in the front windows of independent radio dealers in provincial towns from Glasgow to Plymouth. They sat on the illuminated glass shelves of department store radio counters in London and Oxford. They were a staple of the local co-op electrical departments, where families already held trusting accounts. For those who lived far from a major high street, the Dansette RT111 and RT222 models dominated the thick, glossy pages of Argos and Littlewood's mail-order catalogs, appearing alongside bicycles and fashion garments as essential teenage accessories. Even the serious hobbyists reading Practical Wireless magazine could not ignore the sheer market dominance of the brand, no matter how much they preferred more complex tuning circuits. Stanmore built the physical object. Droitwich provided the signal. The British teenager made it a cultural habit. The production scale required to meet this demand was unprecedented for a company that had started by making wooden cabinets in East London. At its absolute peak in the mid-1960s, Dansette was manufacturing over 1 million audio units a year across its entire radiogram, record player, and transistor radio lines. The factory employment at the Stanmore complex swelled significantly to keep pace with the endless high street orders. The company employed hundreds of local workers. The assembly lines were dominated by skilled women who sat at long, brightly lit benches, working with soldering irons and wire clippers. They meticulously soldered resistors, components that limit or control the flow of electrical current, and capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy in a circuit, onto the green copper-tracked boards of the transistor portables. The factory floor was a cacophony of industrial progress. The smell of hot rosin core solder, the sharp snap of staple guns attaching brightly colored vinyl to wooden frames, and the constant testing of loudspeakers, the parts of a radio that turn the electrical signal into sound moving through air. Before the sets were boxed in cardboard and loaded onto lorries. These lorries fanned out across the British road network, delivering stock to the radio rentals branches, the independent service counters, and the retail showrooms. The economics of this operation were staggering. Every time a teenager or their parents signed a hire purchase agreement for 14 guineas, handing over a few shillings a week to the local dealer, they were feeding cash back into the Stanmore machine. Dansette was not just a brand name printed on a dial. It had become a ubiquitous noun in the British vocabulary. To maintain this momentum, the company continuously expanded their product lines. They moved beyond the simple single-band portables. They introduced tape recorders to capture the radio broadcasts. They designed larger table radios designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, attempting to bridge the gap between teenage rebellion and adult domestic respectability. They went public, becoming a highly traded company on the London Stock Exchange. By 1964, industry estimates suggest they commanded a massive, almost monopolistic share of the British portable audio market for young people. They were a dominant British wireless empire, completely invincible in the eyes of their competitors, having captured the ears and the wallets of an entire generation. Every major British radio or wireless brand has a defining cultural moment that cements its legacy. For Dansette, it was the summer of 1964. By this point, the transistor radio was no longer a technological novelty. It was the essential, inescapable soundtrack to outdoor teenage life. Imagine the scene: a Saturday afternoon on the pebbled expanse of Brighton Beach, or on the damp grass of a public park in Birmingham. A group of teenagers are gathered around a tartan picnic blanket. In the exact center sits a Dansette RT-2222 portable radio. Its bright red and cream casing contrasts sharply with the dull gray concrete of post-war British architecture. The volume control is turned up to its absolute maximum limit. The small internal loudspeaker is being pushed to the very edge of audio distortion. The driver, the moving part of the loudspeaker that physically pushes air to create sound, vibrates violently with the heavy bass of a new Beatles single, broadcast illegally from the Radio Caroline pirate ship, anchored just outside British territorial waters. This was the new geographical split of British listening. In the front room, the parents were listening to the BBC Home Service on a veneered, heavy wooden bush valve set, respecting the broadcaster's solemn schedule and the authority of the domestic hearth. But outside, the rules had entirely changed. In the back garden, in the damp workshop shed, in the cramped student flat, and on the folding table of a holiday caravan, the Dansette portable reigned supreme. Peak British presence meant that Dansette owned the youth space completely. These radios were robust enough to survive the rough handling of teenage life. They were dragged across the country on train journeys. They were shoved casually into the boot of a Ford Anglia. They were dropped onto the uncarpeted floorboards of suburban bedrooms. The clear, circular tuning dial, often decorated with the distinctive, elegant cursive Dansette logo, became a visual shorthand for independence. It perfectly matched the Dansette Major or Bermuda record player sitting on the floor nearby, creating a unified, highly fashionable ecosystem of personal audio in a room that, a generation prior, would have been completely silent. To understand the true glory of this brand, one must look closely at the physical object as it lived in its prime. Sitting on a bedroom windowsill in Manchester, a Dansette portable was a masterpiece of specific sensory details. The brass effect trim caught the afternoon light. The sturdy, oversized plastic knobs offered a satisfying, heavy resistance when turned. The Rexine leatherette cabinet carried a distinct modern smell, a mixture of warm electronics, industrial glue, and fresh vinyl that was completely alien to the dusty, hot wood scent of the family valve radio downstairs. And then there was the nighttime ritual. The Dansette was the ultimate tool for the bedroom listener. When the official BBC broadcasts shut down for the evening, leaving a void on the dial, the teenager would pull the portable radio under the bedsheets. They would rotate the tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, with microscopic, breathless precision. They were hunting through the crackling static, fighting past the whistling interference. Unwanted noise or disturbance added to the signal to find the faint, fading voice of a Radio Luxembourg disc jockey. The selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, was often relatively poor on these mass-produced sets. The sensitivity, how well a radio picks up weak signals, was sometimes barely adequate. But the room did not care about the engineering specifications. The listener did not care about the technical brochure. The set either found the voice in the dark, or it did not. And for millions of British teenagers in the early 1960s, the Dansette always found the voice. The decline of a British radio and wireless empire is rarely a sudden, inexplicable collapse. It is almost always a slow suffocation, brought about by structural market forces that a company, no matter how beloved, cannot outrun. For Dansette, the tragedy was not a failure of imagination, nor was it a sudden loss of engineering competence. It was a brutal, unavoidable collision with the changing economics of global consumer electronics. The turning point for this great British brand arrived in 1967. The British youth market that the Margolin family had practically invented and monopolized was maturing rapidly, and the rules of the high street were changing violently. The teenagers who had eagerly saved their shillings to buy a Dansette RT222 in 1962 were now in their early 20s. They were moving out of their childhood bedrooms, securing professional wages, and their listening expectations had evolved. This evolution was driven by Force 5, technological, retail, and listening culture shift. The simple, mono, medium-wave transistor radio that had defined the early 1960s was no longer the absolute pinnacle of domestic audio desire. The musical landscape had become infinitely more complex. The pop singles of the pirate radio era were giving way to densely layered studio albums. To hear this new music properly, the British consumer market was shifting aggressively towards stereo sound. Young adults now wanted hi-fi separates, a domestic audio system where the amplifier, standalone tuner, record deck, and two separate loudspeakers are all bought as individual components, rather than combined in one box. They wanted cassette recorders, devices that allowed listeners to record audio directly onto compact magnetic tape cartridges. The all-in-one portable radiogram and the chunky, heavy battery radio suddenly looked terribly old-fashioned. A two-tone Dansette, once the ultimate symbol of teenage modernity and independence, now looked to the maturing buyer like a heavy, brightly colored toy from a bygone, more innocent era. While consumer tastes were shifting upward towards complex hi-fi, the lower end of the portable radio market was being attacked with unprecedented ferocity. This was the arrival of Force 4, imports, private labels, and good-enough listening. While the massive J&A Margolin factory in Stanmore was still paying unionized British labor rates to assemble transistor radios in heavy wooden and board cabinets, electronics companies in Japan and Hong Kong were aggressively miniaturizing and cheapening production. Brands like Sony, Sanyo, and National Panasonic began flooding the British high street and mail-order catalogs with a new generation of pocket-sized transistor radios. These Far Eastern imports were radically different from the British standard. They were significantly smaller. They were noticeably lighter. They used all-plastic cabinets created through rapid injection molding, a process that required absolutely no manual wrapping, no stapling, and no complex carpentry. And crucially, they were drastically cheaper. A British teenager scanning the window of a local independent electrical shop in 1967 could suddenly buy a sleek, chrome and black plastic Japanese radio for a fraction of the cost of a bulky, Rexine-covered Dansette. The cheaper imported radio did not have the heavy, satisfying acoustic resonance of a wooden cabinet, but the teenage buyer did not care. The cheap plastic radio did not need to last for decades. It only needed to be loud enough to hear the latest pop single in the kitchen or the school playground. Dansette attempted to respond to this existential threat, but they were entirely trapped by Force 1, British cabinet, valve, transistor, component, labor and manufacturing costs. The entire business model of the Stanmore factory was built upon traditional British manufacturing techniques. They employed carpenters to cut wooden frames. They employed women to manually stretch and glue Rexine fabric around those frames. They paid skilled workers to hand-solder complex printed circuit boards and bolt heavy brass effect-carrying handles onto the finished chassis. The massive overheads of the sprawling Middlesex facility, combined with the rising costs of domestic British labor and traditional components, meant that Dansette simply could not compete on unit cost with the highly automated, streamlined, plastic-focused electronics factories of the Far East. When Dansette attempted to cheapen their own production to match the imports, cutting corners on the thickness of the cabinets, using flimsier, brittle plastics for the dials, and outsourcing some minor component manufacturing, they only succeeded in alienating their core audience. The products stopped feeling like premium British goods, but they were still too expensive to compete with the cheapest imported alternatives. The structural pressure on the company was compounded by a sudden shift in the broadcasting environment. Force 2, BBC standards, license culture, and reception expectations fundamentally altered how young people consumed radio. In August 1967, the British government passed the Marine, etc. Broadcasting Offences Act, effectively outlawing the offshore pirate radio stations that had made the Dansette portable so vital to youth culture. In response, the BBC completely restructured its national output, launching BBC Radio 1, a dedicated, state-sanctioned pop music network broadcast on 247 meters on the medium-wave band. While teenagers still tuned in, the rebellious, illicit thrill of hunting for a fading pirate signal under the bedsheets was gone. Pop music had been institutionalized. Furthermore, the BBC was increasingly pushing the superior audio quality of VHF-FM, a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands, completely free from the crackle and interference of medium wave. Many of the older, mass-market Dansette portables were entirely unequipped to receive VHF-FM broadcasts. They were fundamentally medium-wave machines in a market that was increasingly demanding FM clarity for serious music listening. The final, fatal blow was delivered by the retail infrastructure itself. Force 3. High street retail, rental chains, catalogs, and online price pressure dictated the brand's ultimate fate. High street electrical shops, sensing the massive shift in consumer demand and chasing higher profit margins, began pushing the Japanese imports to the absolute front of their illuminated window displays. Major retail chains and mail-order catalogs ruthlessly dropped the older, heavier Dansette models from their inventory in favor of sleek, imported cassette radios and cheap plastic portables. The brand slowly lost its iron grip on the local service network. The independent local repair shops, once entirely used to replacing a broken carrying handle or soldering a faulty tuning capacitor on a Dansette set, found that the new wave of imported electronics were treated by consumers as entirely disposable. When a cheap plastic pocket radio broke, it was not taken to a service counter for a professional repair. It was simply thrown in the domestic bin and replaced with a new one. By 1968, the financial pressure on the Margolin family had become unbearable. The massive Stanmore factory was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. The Dansette product line had become bloated, confusing, and desperately out of touch with the new stereo age. They attempted to manufacture television sets and entered into a desperate, ill-fated corporate merger, a depressingly common fate for struggling British electronics firms in this era. But the fundamental underlying economics of their business model were completely broken. The final British chapter arrived in late 1969. The financial receivers were officially called in to manage the insolvency. The massive, bustling manufacturing facility in Stanmore, Middlesex, was permanently shuttered. The hundreds of workers, many of whom had spent an entire decade building the physical soundtrack to the 1960s, were summarily laid off. The wooden cabinet molds were abandoned on the factory floor. The detailed technical service manuals were rendered instantly obsolete. The brand name itself, the very word Dansette, which held so much cultural equity and historical weight in the minds of the British public, was unceremoniously purchased by the Rank organization in 1970. This transition marked the ultimate humiliation for a once great manufacturer. It was a textbook case of brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original identity, quality, or manufacturing origin. Rank took the famous Dansette badge, once a cast-iron promise of British-built reliability and teenage rebellion, and simply slapped it onto generic, low-quality, imported audio equipment manufactured overseas. The name that had once defined a generation's private frequency was now just a cheap sticker on a plastic alarm clock radio, sold in a discount supermarket or a budget catalog. The decline was absolute. The margins collapsed. The high street shops cleared their stock. The radio dealers moved on. The Stanmore factory closed. The assembly lines stopped. The cabinet makers went home. The brand was sold. The badge moved overseas. The dial went dark. The teenager grew up. Today, the Dansette name exists entirely as an object of intense, highly specific nostalgia. In the modern British consumer electronics market, the original J&A Margolin Company is long dead. The Rank organization abandoned the diluted badge decades ago, leaving it to fade into corporate obscurity. The original British patents have expired. The massive assembly lines are gone. But, on the secondary market, the brand has been entirely resurrected, not by a corporate parent, but by a fiercely dedicated British preservation and enthusiast community. On platforms like eBay, Gumtree, and Facebook Marketplace, original 1960s Dansette transistor radios and record players command astonishing, premium prices. At crowded vintage radio fairs in places like Harpenden or Royal Wootton Bassett, serious radio collectors and amateur restoration experts hunt aggressively for salvaged parts. They search through dusty cardboard boxes for original brass effect carrying handles. They look for uncracked tuning dials. They desperately seek the exact shade of red or powder blue Rexine fabric required to bring a battered RT111 or RT222 back to factory condition. A vibrant network of YouTube restoration channels and vintage radio forums dedicates thousands of hours to documenting the careful repair process. Dedicated hobbyists film themselves meticulously replacing dried-out electrolytic capacitors, electronic components that degrade over decades and cause the audio circuit to hum or fail completely. They clean the copper tracks on the printed circuit boards. They polish the faded plastic trims. Former BBC Light program listeners, now in their 70s, alongside younger retro audio enthusiasts, buy these restored sets at a premium. They do not buy them because they offer the best audio quality, a modern internet radio, a device that receives radio stations through a broadband internet connection rather than through broadcast signals in the air, is infinitely more capable, offering tens of thousands of global stations with perfect digital clarity. A modern smart speaker, a connected speaker that plays radio and music through voice commands without a physical interface, is far more convenient. They buy them because the original object still matters in a deeply functional way. An old British Dansette radio, with its repaired printed circuit board, a meticulously cleaned dial, and a small internal loudspeaker still capable of moving air, can do something a smart speaker often cannot. It makes the act of listening feel physically attached to a specific place and a specific era. Not simply because the object is old, because the physical act of turning the stiff plastic knob, feeling the mechanical click of the power switch, and actively hunting through the crackling atmospheric static for a signal, asks the listener to actively engage with the airwaves in a way that asking a voice assistant to play a digital stream never will. It demands participation. The physical landscape of British manufacturing today offers absolutely no clue to this massive cultural history. If you visit Stanmore, Middlesex today, The vast, sprawling industrial complex that once housed the Margolin Empire is entirely gone. It has been systematically demolished and replaced by modern residential flats, quiet office parks, and the hum of ordinary suburban life. There is no blue heritage plaque. There is no silent workshop left to explore. There is no monument to the hundreds of local women who soldered the boards, or the men who cut the wooden cabinets. The physical footprint of a company that once built millions of sets has been entirely erased from the British map. But there is a remarkable, unexpected surprise footnote to the Dansette story. While the company is historically famous for failing to adapt to the complex hi-fi era and dying under the weight of cheap plastic imports, the distinct visual language they perfected never actually died. Look closely at the shelves of modern high-street electrical shops or the glossy pages of current department store catalogs selling DAB, digital audio broadcasting, a digital radio system that replaces a continuous analog signal with digital data. Look at the modern Roberts Revival sets or the myriad retro-styled Bluetooth speakers currently flooding the market. They are all, consciously or unconsciously, mimicking the exact design parameters that Dansette established in 1962. They use wooden frames. They wrap them in brightly colored two-tone vinyl or leatherette. They attach sturdy carrying handles. They use large, prominent tuning dials and brass effect grills. The internal electronics are completely different, driven by microchips and digital tuners, but the external shape of teenage desire and domestic portability remains exactly the same. The market rejected the Margolin factory, but it eventually stole their aesthetic. What does this British radio story reveal? It shows that a company can perfectly capture a cultural moment, define the sound of a generation, and build a manufacturing empire of millions of sets, yet still be systematically erased in a matter of months when the underlying economics of global production shift. It reveals the harsh, persistent gap between what Britain says it values: domestic production, iconic design, repairable engineering, and memorable heritage, and what the consumer market actually rewards at the checkout: the cheapest possible price, the smallest possible unit, and the frictionless convenience of the next technological wave. The market demands progress, but it constantly mourns what that progress destroys. Yet, the objects themselves refuse to vanish completely. Somewhere right now, in a dusty suburban loft in Middlesex, a Dansette RT222 transistor radio is still sitting on a wooden shelf, its brass trim heavily tarnished, its leatherette cabinet peeling at the corners, its tuning dial permanently frozen in the 1960s, waiting in the dark for a hand to turn the volume knob and find one more voice in the air. See you in the next one.